Good afternoon, everyone. Can you all hear me? Good. Welcome to Chicago Convocation 2017. Bexley Seabury Seminary is very pleased to welcome all of you here today for this learning experience about bending toward justice. We have some really amazing speakers who will teach us and inspire us today, I'm sure. And we're all here because we're all still learning, right? We'll be hearing from Dr. Gail Fisher-Stewart and Reverend Canon John Floberg and an MDiv student from LSTC, from McCormick Seminary rather, Kenji Kuromatsu. But first, we'll be hearing from our president, Roger Ferlo, who will tell us about what he's still learning. So, with that, I welcome President Roger Ferlo.
I didn't make up the title to this thing, so I had to figure out what to say. And I guess what I'll sum it up before I even begin with a kind of paradox, a paradoxical answer to what I'm still learning. The more I know, the less I understand. That's the intellectual and the empiricist speaking. But the converse is the theologian speaking. The less I understand, the more I know. So let me get, I think the best way for me to do this today, it's an odd moment for me because 2 months from now, after 32 years of ministry, I'm retiring. And so those of you who are either contemplating retirement or have watched friends contemplate retirement know that it's it's a very strange moment, especially in our culture, which is so work-driven, that one thinks that retirement really should be called something else, like restructuring or something. So this is the beginning of my restructuring, and I wanted to take the opportunity to just share some reflections. And I wanted to have some help, and so I've been reading a lot of R.S. Thomas recently. R.S. Thomas is a wonderful Welsh poet who was an Anglican priest in Wales. And I'll say a little more about the sort of paradox of being an Anglican priest in Wales, especially for someone like him. So what I've actually, not all of us are good, are experienced at sort of listening to poems, so I actually put copies out for you. And so if you'd like to follow, that would be great. This is what I'm still learning. Here's a poem called The Answer, which was great. I mean, it's done. Not darkness, but twilight, in which even the best of minds must make its way now. And slowly the questions occur, vague but formidable for all that. We pass our hands over their surface like blind men, feeling for the mechanism that will swing them aside. They yield, but only to reform as new problems. And one does not even do that, but towers immovable before us. Is there no way other than thought of answering its challenge? There is an anticipation of it to the point of dying. There have been times when, after long on my knees in a cold chancel, a stone has rolled from my mind, and I have looked in and seen the old questions lie folded and in a place by themselves, like the piled grave clothes of love's risen body. It's a wonderful Easter notion of what the old questions that need to be laid aside as the new questions arise. And really that's where I'm still learning, and I think you all are as well. Let me say a bit more about the poet. R.S. Thomas, as I said, was a Welsh priest, lived a very long time, almost throughout the entire 20th century. He was a fervent Welsh nationalist. So he was acutely aware of what it means to be a cultural outsider. And as a good Welshman, he felt he was subject to what he experienced as an alien and oppressive imperial culture, the Church of England. And he was a courageous religious thinker, not only in his political advocacy, as a man who felt still colonized after all these years, but he was also not afraid to make common cause as a theologian, as a priest and theologian, with the Thomas the Apostle, whom we heard about on Low Sunday, the incredulous Thomas, or for that matter, with the church father who prayed, "Lord, I believe, help my unbelief." So I'm enlisting R.S. Thomas's help in reflecting with you this afternoon on what I guess I'd like to consider the three central themes of seminary life: church, seminary itself, and by extension, the life of the mind, and finally, ordained ministry, as at least I've experienced. Church, seminary, and ordained ministry. The future of all three of these seems fragile. Fragile. Especially when we think of them or experience church, seminary, and the life of the mind, and ordained ministry, when we experience them as up against a current nationalist, xenophobic, racist, anti-intellectual, polarized, and frightened American polity. We're in the midst of a racial, ethnic, political, religious, and cultural moment of religious crisis. And it's one that our panelists this afternoon, I think, are going to discuss in some exquisite and specific detail. So I'm not here to steal their fire. So I want to ask you to indulge me in a more personal and perhaps a bit more detached, even old-fashioned kind of reflection on these three themes: church, seminary, and the life of the mind, and ordained ministry. As I say, I speak to you just a few weeks before retiring from this position after 5 challenging, but in the end, I hope rewarding years as president of this seminary federation and of these 2 federated, I guess in American terms, ancient seminaries, Seabury Western and Bexley Hall, and after 32 years of ordained ministry. So I hope you don't mind my continuing to call on R.S. Thomas, priest and poet, to provide language perhaps more piercing and more eloquent than mine could ever be. So here, first then, church. I'm old, or at least feeling it. And so I'm now of 2 minds about church. About our church, or for that matter, institutional religion in general. I find myself, year after year, with increasing impatience with church, with what I have seen so often to be a kind of self-centered and self-righteous churchiness that feeds the kind of marginalization that we all so often feel as church-going people. That's the one mind I have. But the other mind I have, particularly in these last days, is a real regard for and care for institutions. Institutions. Because this is a time when all of our institutions have been subjected to vicious, politicized rhetoric. It's amazing that, I don't know if you read Ross Douthat. I mean, he's not my favorite guy, Ross Douthat. He's the Roman Catholic, the converted conservative young Roman Catholic columnist of the New York Times. I grew up Roman Catholic, and I know I was a baptized Roman Catholic, and I know the difference between a baptized Roman Catholic and a converted Roman Catholic. Ross Douthat is definitely a converted Roman Catholic. But he wrote, I don't know if you saw this piece a couple of weeks ago, he wrote a piece recommending that, as he calls them, liberals should consider going back to a mainline church. Because the mainline churches are actually doing what liberals complain is not being done. This is from Ross Douthat. Of course, who reads the New York Times anymore? So I, in some ways, I'm glad for that kind of institutional shout-out from the sort of least expected places. So this sort of double-mindedness is something that I'm trying to resolve, and I'm still learning to resolve. This real impatience, if not sometimes fury, with what the church does to itself. I've often said, the Episcopal Church, basically, it needs to get over itself. It needs to get over itself and move into something that really matters. On the one hand, I don't want anyone to get over the Episcopal Church. I don't want any of us to get over church as a whole. Because it's only in community, in collective believing, that Christ really matters. So, I call on R.S. Thomas to help me. He wrote this, I found 2 poems. One of them is about one of my minds, and the other is the other. And the first one's called The Empty Church. Before I read it, there's an explanatory note. I think that the he that he's referring to is actually God in Christ. And I think the stone trap of the opening line, I take it that that's one of the ancient village churches in the Welsh heartland. Now, pretty much empty of parishioners. The British have this horrible word to use for those churches that sort of pass their time. They're called redundant. Redundant churches. As if any church could be redundant. So this poem's called The Empty Church. They laid this stone trap for him, enticing him with candles, as though he would come like some huge moth out of the darkness to beat there. He had burned himself before in the human flame and escaped, leaving the reason torn. He will not come any more to our lure. Why then do I kneel still, striking my prayers on a stone heart? Is it, I hope, one of them will ignite yet and throw on its illumined walls the shadow of someone greater than I can understand? Is it, I hope, one of them that will ignite yet and throw on its illumined walls the shadow of someone greater than I can understand? There's a book by Terry Eagleton, another Roman Catholic turned atheist, turned Marxist, turned atheist believer. Terry Eagleton's a very interesting character. And he just published a book with a great title. It's called Hope Without Optimism. Hope without optimism. And that for me sums up where I am with the church. Hope without optimism. And here's what hope looks like. Thomas's poem called The Kingdom. It's a long way off. But inside it, there are quite a few things going on. Festivals at which the poor man is kind and the consumptive is healed. Mirrors in which the blind look at themselves and love loves at them back. And industry is for mending the bent bones and the minds fractured by life. It's a long way off. But to get there takes no time, and admission is free. If you will purge yourself of desire and present yourself with your need only and the simple offering of your faith, green as a leaf. So that's church. My second theme, seminary. Seminary and the life of the mind. I guess it's Mayor Emanuel who was credited with this statement, but it might have been Axelrod. It was, never let a crisis go to waste. And the board, and many board members are here, the board of directors of Bexley Hall, Seabury Western, and emeritus members know what that means. 2008 was a year of tremendous crisis for Seabury Western. As I joked to somebody, well, Bexley Hall didn't have a crisis in 2008. Bexley Hall has been a crisis since Philander Chase started the thing. One after the other after the other. But never let a crisis go to waste. With a committed board, with a loyal and committed faculty and staff, and with students and bishops who've been willing to take a chance, we've sort of made something new. And in the course of all that, and that's been my 5 years, which I say were both challenging and I think in the end, wonderful. The biggest disappointment, I think, was nostalgia for an outdated system. That the persistence of nostalgia, particularly among ordained people, who one would have thought would know better. This persistence of nostalgia is one disappointment. And the other was this sort of growing, I'm not sure what the word is, but a growing distrust or disregard among bishops and commissions on ministry, even disdain in some ways, for accredited academic programs leading to ordination. It's a trend that I find to be very distressing, not just because I'm a seminary president, but because the life of the mind is what, in some ways, sets us apart as believers in this little corner of the kingdom. So, many of you are familiar, not just with Bexley Seabury, but with the ups and downs of several of our Episcopal seminaries in recent years. One in Boston, one in New York, but really all of us, in some ways, have had to deal with a tremendously changed theological landscape in education. So instead of talking about the Episcopal situation, let me say a little bit about the Lutheran situation, which is in some ways analogous to ours. And of course, Bexley Hall has had deep experience with Lutherans. And until recently, Seabury was embedded in sort of the Lutheran high headquarters on Higgins Road. So our Lutherans are our friends, sort of, most of the time, kind of. There's an article by Mark Granquist, who is an ELCA pastor teaching at Luther Seminary, one of our friend seminaries in Minneapolis. He wrote this piece in a Lutheran journal. And it was a kind of reflection on what's happening in Lutheran seminaries. And really, it's quite parallel to what's happening in ours. And I thought I'd sort of give you a little sense of what he had to say. He said that, and obviously speaking now of Lutheran seminaries, but you can sort of do the math with Episcopal seminaries. It's almost the same story. That there were two streams of influence as these schools came to themselves. One was a long tradition of university-based theological education, a long tradition of that. But for Lutherans, especially, a second stream, which he calls the product of the Lutheran pietistic tradition, that focused on faith formation and practical ministry skills. So he saw this, Lutherans are kind of an immigrant church, and he saw this as, right from the beginning, sort of separating two ways of understanding theological education in Lutheran churches. It's sort of that long-standing division between the so-called academic and the so-called practical. Granquist argues that by the 1960s, the goal to combine these two streams, as he said, had been reached. So as he puts it, we would be forming pastors to be academically sound, spiritually wise, and practically ready for ministry. I like the word practically because it means two things, right? Forming pastors to be academically sound, spiritually wise, and practically ready for ministry. But then he goes on to say, which should be no surprise to anyone in this room, the ideal model in the 1960s anticipated a young man recently graduated from a liberal arts college, and he puts in parentheses, preferably a Lutheran college, who would then move on to the seminary campus, live there for 2 years of academic study, followed by an internship year in a parish somewhere, and then return for a final year, add to that a quarter year of pastoral education in a clinical setting. It would be modeled on a cohort kind of procedure so that you're always with the same folks, moving through seminary. I know, John, you've got 2 of your classmates here in the room, at least 2. And that whole sense of you have classmates as seminarians. You moved through the process together, and you had pastoral and spiritual formation occurring in common activities on the seminary campus, and I love this part, led by the example of the faculty. Well, I've been around a long time, and I lived on a residential campus for 8 years, and boy, did we resist that model as faculty members. But there it is. That was the ideal. And I think that's the source of all this nostalgia, especially among clergy ordained about the time I was, in the 70s and the 80s. But then Grand President goes on to say, this was both an expansive and an expensive view of theological education. And as he puts it ran headlong into a storm of stress. Inflation, deferred maintenance, second career students with families, declining denominational contributions. I mean, one difference between the Lutherans and us is that the Lutheran Church actually gives money to their seminaries. I hate to break it to you, the Episcopal Church has no obligations whatever to support its seminaries, except a moral obligation. So then that all was going on, and then the 90s and the 2000s hit. Okay, increased student debt as the cost of undergraduate education soared, particularly if you were still looking for, as it were now at this point, young men and young women who would come with liberal arts educations, because it's the liberal arts degrees that became the most expensive ones. Okay? And you add to that, what the Lutherans know, and we know all too well, is the effects of church conflict. The effects of church conflict. That takes me back to my first point about the Episcopal Church needing to get over itself. In some ways, how to put this? Those who would like to dismiss us would in fact like to encourage us to keep fighting with each other, because that sucks all of our energy. And then he also points out, not to mention, as he says, a significant decline of numbers of candidates for ordination. Because all you have to do is think of a 25-year-old or a 30-year-old or a 35-year-old standing back, looking at the church and saying, do I want to get into that mess? That's a Lutheran talking. Now, that nothing to do with the Episcopal Church whatsoever. Nothing to do with the Episcopal Church. But obviously, it all rings familiar. And if you now talk to Frank Yamada, who is currently the president of McCormick, but is about to become the president of the Association of Theological Schools, this is the case in every denominational school. In every denominational school, these are the pressures, these are the stresses, this is the crisis, and now the question is, can we turn the crisis into an opportunity? Which takes me back to my gratitude to our board and our faculty and our staff, where no good crisis goes to waste. Okay. So we have moved in ways that actually other seminaries are beginning to move, to turn toward a reliance on partnerships. We are no longer, as the Episcopal deans have been saying to each other, and trying to actually act like this, that we're no longer in competition with each other. Okay. And it's a return to really a 19th century model, 18th century model that precedes the academic and the pietistic one. And that's to say that theological education, formation for ministry, best happens in an academically infused contextual setting. And of course, there's contextual learning, which means, as many of our students are now experiencing in Bexley Seabury, that they are in teaching congregations. And there is a kind of a compact between the congregation and the seminary and the student, that there's kind of mutual learning, that we will learn from each other. And of course, there are risks of this. One is, it assumes that there's some kind of theological coherence among our parishioners. And of course, that's not always the case, which is why we see this as a kind of the model for us has to be reciprocity, that we have as much to offer to our congregations and faith communities as we know their faith communities and congregations have to offer to us and to our students. There's also, it's clear that we need and are beginning to re-emphasize the role of clergy as teachers, particularly in this post-Christendom world, where people simply don't know what we're talking about. So the theological language has to be completely rethought and revamped, as it were. And also, we need to move clergy, people preparing for ordination or service in the church, as whether it's lay or ordained, move us from this sort of administrator-therapist model, which is the one I was trained in, to what I would call restoring the rabbinate. That, can we imagine our clergy taking the same place in their faith communities as my friend the rabbi takes in his or hers, where their job is to theologize, their job is to lead the spiritual life of the parish, and all this other stuff is the parish's responsibility. I mean, that would be a huge shift in the way we understand ordained ministry. A willingness, I think, in the end, to embrace adaptive change rather than technical fixes, if I could use the jargon of the business school. Which means to me that always have our eye towards God's mission in the world and not ours. So, R.S. Thomas. I love this title of this poem. Which? It's all about choices. Which? And in the book I read, God is love. But lifting my head, I do not find it so. Shall I return to my book, and between print, wander in air heavy with the scent of this one word? Or not trust language, only the blows that life gives me, wearing them like those red tokens with which an agreement is sealed? I love it that a priest can talk like this. I think it would come as a great shock to many priests that it's okay to talk like this. It would come as a great relief to many parishioners that you do talk like this. So there's my favorite, the listener in the corner. This is I'm going to say this poem in honor of every introvert in the room, every listener in the corner. Right? Last night, the talk was of the relationship of the self to God. Tonight, of God to the self. Alone in the corner, one sits, whose silence persuades of the pointlessness of the discourse. He drinks at another fountain that builds itself equally from the dust of ruffians and saints. Outside, the wind howls. The stars that once were the illuminated city of the imagination, to him are fires extinguished before the eye's lenses formed. The universe is a large place with more of darkness than light. But slowly a web is spun there as minds like his swing themselves to and fro. If I could teach my students to allow their minds simply to swing to and fro, I would feel that my life was worth something. So I have to be frank with you at this time. I feel more and more like the listener in the corner these days. Retirement, restructuring, whatever we call it, it always calls for a retrospection of some sort. I guess I'm now guilty of that as I stand before you. But I've always found the sort of churchy language of retrospection unappealing. I hate when church people talk about my journey or my pilgrimage. Okay? No, that's much too organized. That's not. But I do know that all of us need to in some way impose a storyline on life's chaos. We all do it one way or the other. To impose a storyline on life's chaos and on life's gifts. Because that's actually, after all, what the gospel writers did. They imposed a storyline on the chaos of that crucifixion. Well, I was ordained in the early 1980s, and it was a very different church. Ed Browning, who remembers Ed Browning? He was we're all old in this room, right? Ed Browning was the presiding bishop. This church would have no outcasts. It was an exciting time for me to be a part of this church. The prayer book had just been approved, and women were being ordained, and it was the beginnings of LGBT awareness. Louis Crew was a friend of mine in the old days, and still is, except he's even older than I am. I mean, that's what the 1980s were like. And I had the great fortune in my ordination to be in all three parishes in which I was either assistant or rector. All three of them had schools, and so I understood early on that the nature of ordained life had to be committed to the shaping of the minds of folks as well as the souls. My favorite expression through all this time is this title of that wonderful book by Jean Leclerc, "The Love of Learning and the Desire for God." Not different things, but two aspects of the same energy. But I also was priest in my first rectorate during a real time of church tension. I was in Pittsburgh and witnessed firsthand and participated in some ways in what really became this really ugly polarization of the Episcopal Church, one in which we're still trying to recover. So that was then, and this is now. What was it? I was talking to the Dean of Erie the other day, and he said something about, there was a second generation of priests who got all angry at us, the baby boomers, and now the that generation after them is now looking up to the baby boomers as having some kind of wisdom. That is a scary thought. So I want to end with two poems and then maybe have a little bit of discussion. Well, actually one poem, and this poem is called "The Priest." He had read a poem called "The Priest." So as I read this poem, I think that in some ways his Welsh experience is so far removed from my American experience. On the other hand, what he's saying about the nature of ministry seems to me to ring true to both what I have been called to be, who I've been called to be, and what I think all of us remain called to be as baptized Christians. The priest. The priest picks his way through the parish. Eyes watch him from windows, from the farms, hearts wanting him to come near. The flesh rejects him. Women, this is long before women's ordination, women pouring from the black kettle stir up the whirling tea grounds of their thoughts, offer him a dark filling in the smiling sandwich. I don't know if you've been a parish priest. You know what that means. I mean, there's always an under reason or something. Priests, I love this line. Priests have a long way to go. That is so true. A long way to go. The people wait for them to come to them over the broken glass of their vows, making them pay with their sweat's coinage for their correction. He goes up a green lane through growing birches. Lambs cushion his vision. He comes slowly down in the dark, feeling the cross warp in his hands, handing on its thoughts icicles. Crippled soul, so you say, looking at him from the mind's height, limping through life on his prayers. There are other people in the world sitting at table contented, though the broken body and the shed blood are not on the menu. Let it be so, I said. Amen and amen. And I guess I'll end with amen. Thank you. We've got a little bit of time. There are many friends and priests in the room, and I'd just like to hear your reflections on either what you remember and have seen in the seminary, what your sense of church is. I mean, it's wide open. Sir.
To go back to your point about contextual education infused with theology, how do you create that in a small town parish 150 miles from metropolitan Chicago? struggling to afford even a part-time priest.
Mm-hmm. It's a great question, and we've been asking that question, and we go there. That is, I've never thought that a lack of resources of the kind you've just described stops parishes from becoming deeply formed in their faith. I've long since learned that it's small parishes that are not consumed by conflict, or who have somehow, small parishes who've gotten over this sort of sense of, that everything here is scarce, turn around quite quickly, and basically our sense is that the way we're going to allow small parishes to do their part is to allow small parishes to do their part. And part of it's going to demand from the seminaries, not just our seminary, but all the seminaries, a real kind of, how to put this, agreement to a kind of diaspora, that we have to decentralize our work, which is why our little slogan is that we're the seminary beyond walls, and this is, really make that happen is going to take some real investment. Others? Yep.
I wanted to push back a little. I like the idealism of the theological priest who's not any longer
the rabbi,
or rabbi is not the administrator/therapist. But I was just thinking about an experience just this past Sunday when I couldn't go visit somebody in the hospital, and I had the communion kit going somewhere else, and could someone visit this person, and maybe they couldn't have communion, so would you like to take some healing oil? And the question that my parishioner asked me was not, what should I say, how do I lay hands on someone, but how do I get into the hospital and what should I say? Like, they saw me as the person with the collar, who has an easy entry, but he was completely comfortable because he's had the laying on of hands, I'm guessing, himself. He did not need me to tell him what she needed.
Yeah.
So I guess my pushback on that a little bit is I feel like my role is more the connection point in which offering people to live out their ministry, and people come forward and they know how to do it. They don't need the teaching in that sense.
Yeah, I think we're in agreement there. When I say about the teaching, I mean that's actually a rabbinical role as well. Teachers show us,
or just give us the opportunity.
Give us the opportunity,
question,
right. But what I'm talking about teaching is actually to really embrace teaching. I mean, I'm haunted. I was 8 years at Virginia Seminary, and I'm haunted by the fact how much resistance there was among our students to learning anything about how to teach. Just resistance. That's not what I'm about as a priest. And in some ways, it was still sexist and misogynist in a way that they didn't understand. I mean, they assumed that's what the church school teacher does, not me. And of course, the church school teacher is going to, you get the old paradigm. So that's what I have in mind. But part of the teaching function is to help in discernment, and that's exactly what you were doing. And if you need to, and if you're relied upon to be the one that can open the gates, that's great. That's great. Yeah. Others. John, was I unfair to you in that?
No, it is interesting. I think every generation cohort is going to have their way that works out.
Yeah.
And after this sort of baby boomers sense that we were going to set the world right, then to have a generation come along and say, you guys really messed things up, would you please get out of the way so we can fix it? And now being at it long enough to see the next generation after that saying, wow, you guys really did some cool stuff. I'd like to learn from you.
I'd love to know what the cool stuff you did, John, 30 years ago. Yeah. No, I think it's right. I think it's true. Yeah. Others? I'm curious, had anyone ever heard of Aristomus before? A couple. Yeah. I strongly recommend reading.
Roger.
Lisa.
Yes. So of those three things, so church, seminary, what was the other one? I feel like Perry. What's his name?
Ordained ministry.
Yeah, ordained ministry, yeah.
That's it.
Three things. I don't have a long attention span. No, but I just, if one of those kind of, as you're looking at your restructuring.
My own personal restructuring.
Yes, your personal restructuring. is one of those kind of glowing more brightly for you as your core identity? I'm just curious.
Life of the mind.
Yeah.
Yeah. Partly because that's on my own history. I didn't start out in seminary. I started out as an English professor. There's the R.S. Thomas. Yeah, it's the life of the mind, particularly because I feel surrounded in this culture by just a poisonous anti-intellectualism. Just a poisonous anti-intellectualism. A mistrust of expertise. I grew up in a working class family, got full scholarship to Colgate. I was so proud. And to be dismissed as elitist because of that, it doesn't feel right. And so, if anything, my restructuring is going to entail some kind of advocacy for, frankly, intellectual excellence, and a renewed respect for expertise. So that answer. I'm turning 66. I don't know how much time you have to do that, but I think it's important to set an example, especially in the current climate. Yeah.
Where does your cello come in?
Yeah, you know me, don't you? The cello, that's one of the things. I started playing the cello actually in 7th grade for a year. Those were the days when public schools had orchestras. And not only did they had orchestras, they actually issued instruments. And I was given this sort of plywood cello. And Mr. Mathers was he was amazing. But I was that high, and the cello was that high, and I had to walk home back and forth with it, and I was ruthlessly mocked. So I gave it up. But then I married this wonderful woman whose mother is a cellist, or was a cellist, and I walked into the house in Hyde Park, and there was this cello in the corner, and I said, Nancy, do you mind if I borrow this? And that was it. So I started learning at 35. And over the years, it's been a kind of a mainstay. It's what the kind of things that you do in order to sort of stay grounded. So I'm now, every Tuesday night, I play with an endocrinologist, a copy editor, a 32-year-old violinist who actually went to MIT and now teaches at the boot school because that's where the real money is, and me. And we play string quartets every Tuesday night from 7:30 to 10:30. And that's going to,
But that nurtures your spirit,
Absolutely.
doesn't it?
Absolutely.
And certainly that would be something we
Yeah.
have to take into consideration.
And that's the other thing about the intellectual. We just went to the Ounce of Prevention, that wonderful group that Ann Toohey's a member of our board. She's the president of Ounce of Prevention. They just had their big gala at the Hilton, and the speaker there was this extraordinary woman scientist from University of Washington, talking about the development of the baby's brain between birth and 7 months. And it was so clear that that language and music were what shaped the brain. It was the strongest argument I've ever heard to the fact that arts education and STEM education are not opposites, but complementary. Yeah, Rosemary.
Yes, I was delighted to read in Community News that the diaconal enrichment program is going to have a requirement for baptismal ministry. And when Cara talked about her experience, it reminded me of that, because in that theology, the clergy are to equip the people of God to go out and do ministry. And a few years ago, just after the church revised the canons for ministry, I was on the Standing Commission for Ministry Development, and that's one of the things we emphasized and even went further and talked about ministry and daily life. And so I'm hoping that the clergy that take that course will be able to really have live into that, and I hope will also expand to priests, because I feel they really need to know that.
I mean, what we're really hoping is that we would have lay people in that course. The ideal would be to have all four orders of ministry in that course. Yeah, we're excited. You can talk to John Daly and others afterwards about what it might look like. But yeah, thank you. Yeah, Newland.
I'm just thinking about I could do reflections on seminary. I won't do that, but in a parish, one thing I have yet to find, and it could be I haven't gone broadly enough in different congregations, is the lack of conversations that have depth.
Yeah.
We can talk about life and death issues. So much of it is surface chit-chat. I think that's just
No, it's true.
a challenge.
It is a challenge, and what I've found in the 4 parishes I've been a part of in this is that it's not as if people don't want to go into depth. There's no reward. That is, and I'll put it another way. You're really kicking against assumptions at that point. And so what I find is the more you get people in smaller groups and basically where they're making a compact, not to be superficial, people will do it. People will do it. Well, thank you all. We're going to take a 5-minute break, and then we're going to start our panel. But thank you all for your attention. Appreciate it.